When you talk about the role of meat in our history, in our developmental history, and I'm going to excuse me for the pun because I'm going to throw one out there. Do you get into beef with vegetarians? Do they?
Well, I think I hedge enough that most people begrudgingly will be okay with most vegans and vegetarians are okay, because I always make the point that you can live a very healthy lifestyle with vegetarians and vegans. I will say, and I've never met a vegetarian or vegan who adamantly disagrees with the notion that meat eating was an important part of our past. Lots of things were important parts of our past that we've decided we don't want to do anymore for various reasons, right? So I don't think the fact that we once did it and it was important means that it's morally the right thing or even okay to do now. I don't have to think very hard to come up with examples like that. So no, I don't get into fight with vegans and vegetarians. And my first book was very much in support of the idea that animals have a rich inner life. And they have the same emotional programs that we have, and those drives and emotions and instincts mean almost the exact same thing to them as they mean to us, and they drive them to similar behaviors. So, I started eating a lot less meat while researching that book, because it's really hard to deny that animals feel pretty much the same things that we do. They don't think like we do, but they feel like we do, I think.
Oh, my fictitious God. I'm reading through your book, Not So Different, Finding Human Nature in Animals. And if there is something that's going to put me over the tipping point in just forgoing meat altogether, it's just reading about animals and chimpanzee justice and chimpanzee empathy and other species. Wow.
Yeah. No, it's true. Animals really care for one another, and they recognize suffering in their affiliates. And their conspecifics. There's even evidence that they recognize suffering across species boundaries and care enough to make a difference. I mean, there are stories of rats that will swim underwater for 20, 30 seconds to save a friend who is trapped underwater as well. Now, these experiments prove their point so well that it becomes clear that they probably aren't ethical to do because of the distress that these rats are clearly under. And people might not ascribe much of an inner experience to rats. And in a sense, that's okay too. What it means to me, though, is that the inner experience that we have clearly was a logical progression from earlier forms, simpler forms. Anyway, in fact, I actually don't think ours is any more complex. I think we think about it more. We have another set of inputs, which is our deliberation, our internal dialogue, and our we have the ability to contemplate our decisions. And so there's an extra layer on it. But I think that the recognition of suffering and the recognition of everything else that comes with social living is the same between humans and animals. It's really hard to defend, at the very least, factory farming or other ways of treating animals in which they're just absolutely no regard for their well-being. Yeah. So, and I think, if you're interested in more books along these lines, I really recommend Mark Bekoff. There many people have written this. Carl Safina and Joan Roughgarden and what's her name at College of William and Mary. I'm blanking. Barbara King. So many people have written on this. Mark Bekoff has the books that I think were most influential for me, and I cite him a lot in my work. But animals have a rich inner life.
What really resonated with me was the story of Knuckles the chimpanzee.
Yeah.
It was incredibly moving, to tell you the truth. I work with people who have disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And hearing about Knuckles was like, wow.
Yeah. So, and anybody who's listening, you can just go to YouTube. You're already on YouTube. Open up a new tab after we're done, and search for Knuckles the chimpanzee, and you're going to find videos of Knuckles. Knuckles has the cerebral palsy, essentially, this chimpanzee version of cerebral palsy. And what's interesting about him is that he's not particularly well coordinated with his motor control. He's bumping into people. He doesn't quite know how to behave the way that the other chimpanzees do in the social, because chimpanzees have a very rigid sort of social structure, and they bully one another. They're kind of aggressive, and they're a dominance-based hierarchy, and so they're kind of nasty to one another. But Knuckles, he can bump into a bigger chimp, and they don't mind at all. They let him go. They move him around. They'll even help him eat and drink sometimes. They'll steady his hands for him. They show an incredible amount of compassion for him, because something inside them, it registers that he's a little different, that we can't hold him to the same standards of these rigid social rules, and that he doesn't mean any harm. And so, and it just goes to show what I would often call the atheist imperative. There's no reason to not be nice to one another. There's no reason to not care for one another. And so when animals have the opportunity to care for one another, they do. Would they do this in the wild? I don't know, because in the wild, they have a lot of selection pressure, to put it one way, to put it evolutionary. But basically, survival is not a given. Their needs are not always fully met like they were, because Knuckles is in a sanctuary. All the needs are met there. And so, it's much more competitive out in the wild. But see, humans, how did we treat people who were differently able until 10 minutes ago, right? So, we weren't any different. When life was rough for us, we were rough on each other. But when we have more of a sort of relaxed ability and we can afford to care for one another, we do, or at least some of us do.
What I really find fascinating is that we have these background programs that we are unaware of in morality, empathy, justice, and it's as if our frontal lobes are just there to rationalize what's going on within us.
I think that's a good way to think about it. I think that that morality is much more of an instinct than it is a reasoned position. We establish a lot of reasoning around it, but what you notice across all world cultures is that the morality, the general rules, are very, 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 very similar. So if you take what's right and wrong among all world religions, they line up not perfectly, but almost always do they line up when it comes to interpersonal relations. Sometimes they don't line up when they talk about your duties to the religion or to the deity and so forth. But if you subtract all of that stuff away, most of the world religions really agree with one another. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's baked into us. It's in our DNA. It's not something that we decided. And it's not always just that it makes sense too, because some people would argue, well, it just makes sense to get along. No, not necessarily, because there are social structures in other animals that aren't built around the same kind of morality that we have. But if you look at our closest relatives, obviously it matches. So I would say that morality really is an instinct. And so when people try to reason their way, because you have people who are like, oh, well, there's cultural relativism and there are all these different versions of morality. And I think a lot of times those are stumbling blocks to understanding, because we don't reason our way around other instincts, right? Like hunger, or that's a more primal one, but the other kinds of instincts, we accept them as instincts and we don't have to establish a lot of reasoning around them. But for some reason, morality, we do. I think because religion has felt like they owned it for so long. And then when religion became more philosophical, as we moved into modernism, all of this philosophy of morality sprung up. But I'm not saying any of that work is wrong or not worthwhile, but I'm saying they're trying to rationalize something that is inherently just instinctual. It's not necessarily rational or reasoned. So yeah, but that I just find the continuity between human morality and chimpanzee morality is too striking to ignore.
Sure. Talk about chimpanzee justice too. They seem to have a pretty fine or primate justice, or just animals experiencing and exercising justice. Yeah.
So, basically any animal that has to work together or live together with other of its kind will have rules of conduct, and they'll have codes of conduct, and you're expected to do certain things. You're expected not to do other things. And to enforce that, they have punishments. And that punishment in a social species, which is what we're talking about, usually involves some form of ostracization. So being removed from the group has negative consequences for your survival in a social species. Not all species are social, by the way. Like orangutans are a great exception to this, because they're really social in only 2 times of their life: early childhood, nursing, and then sex. And that's pretty much it. They're very solitary as adults. And so not surprisingly, we don't find these social instincts in them because it didn't serve them. It's not part of their history. But in all of the other creatures, we have a surprising amount in common in terms of this. And we do forms of this ostracization as well. That's, children have time out, and prison is the natural, logical extension of this. for good or for ill, the idea of punishment by removing people from the group is an ancient one. And it's felt very, very intensely in a social species. We don't want to be disconnected from our group. We want to be back in the group, and we want to, and those are, again, they're instincts. They're not really purely reasoned. Now, I think reason comes into the picture and how to do it more effectively. And I think our criminal justice system is almost a perfect lesson in how to do it poorly. But there are criminal justice systems around the world that have figured this out in one way or another, that if we sort of more mimic animal ways of doing, it actually works better, and people want to be back in the group and be successful. And they want to feel committed and connected. So I'm hopeful, actually, because of all the uprisings that are happening right now, and the complaint which began about the horrific murder of George Floyd, which echoed in all ways the murder of others like him. It's now connecting to many other forms of struggle. Of class struggle and of institutionalized power and racism. Yes. And it's starting to connect in all kinds of forms where we feel as members of the group that the social contract has been violated. The people are not following the rules. We're not, treating each other fairly and equally. And so a lot of our animal instincts of injustice are being triggered. And yes. So I'm actually hopeful, even though I watched, with horror the murder, and I think all white people need to watch. I couldn't get all the way through the video, but and so I was devastated. But it's as I'm participating in protests and I'm watching other people participating in protests, I see a social movement that has all the wind behind us. It really does, because it's connecting a lot of different kinds of movements and a lot of different kinds of injustice. And it's finally connecting to class struggles, and these are the ways that animals work out justice. So I'm hopeful, cautiously hopeful. Mm-hmm.
When I'm thinking about the protests that are going on, I think about the monkey studies. When one monkey gets a carrot and another monkey gets a grape, and the monkey that gets the grape realizes that the monkey getting the carrot is kind of getting screwed, because monkeys would rather have a grape than a carrot. You want to talk about that a bit?
Right. So this study has had several permutations since the classic one, but the classic one involved a cucumber and a grape. And this is originally with capuchin monkeys. It's been done with many species since then. But the idea was the monkey was perfectly fine to perform a task and get a cucumber as a reward until she or he saw another monkey doing the same task and getting a grape, which is the better treat in their view because it's sweeter. And then all of a sudden the cucumber was not good enough, and they would fling the cucumber at the researcher. That's the classic video. You can find this on YouTube. Fairness monkey experiment, I think, will get you there. And Sarah Brosnan is the researcher in the video. She was a postdoc or a graduate student, one of the two, at Emory, and now she has her own lab, and she's done it with chimpanzees as well. And what's interesting about this is that there's so much to unpack about the experiment. First of all, it shows that value is always relative, right? And it looks like wealth in our society now, it's always relative. It doesn't matter that even some of the poorest people in the United States have things that kings didn't have 300 years ago. That doesn't matter at all, because that's not how we measure resources and wealth. It's always measured in relative terms, not absolute. And that's how our sense of justice gets triggered as well. The other thing that I think is interesting is that among chimpanzees, this has been shown that they will occasionally stand up for injustice even when they're the beneficiaries. So if they're getting the better reward, but they see another chimpanzee getting the worse reward, not every time, sometimes they will actually refuse to participate and they'll stand up for the injustice. But, and I said sometimes, not all the time, the difference is how closely they're affiliated with the chimpanzee that's being cheated. So if it's a stranger chimpanzee, it's like, yeah, too bad. But if it's a close affiliate, they'll be more. And isn't that the way we are, right? If you will stand up for justice, if it's someone you know, or someone in your country, someone with your same job, someone of your same race, profession, whenever there's some kind of kinship and affiliation, then you'll feel that sense of injustice much more. But if it's someone that doesn't look like you in a faraway country, who's jumping out the windows of their iPhone factory, it's like, how else are we going to build the iPhone? I guess they should treat them better. I'm going to send an email about that. You know what I mean? Like, our sense of justice just doesn't get tripped. when we don't feel a sense of closeness. And so for all the evils of globalization, it's also probably the only way that we're going to really see each other as all part of one connected family, which I think we are. So we have to, the more interconnected we are, we have to recognize the humanity on the other side of the world. But we're built to do that. We really are. If you teach children and you expose children to people that are not like them, to cultures that aren't around them, the more that we have this intercultural contact and familiarity, the more their sense of self expands. Right? They're not just an American. They're not just a white person. They're a human. They're part of this global. So I do have also hope, because I think that we're doing some of that anyway in our public schools. We need to do more, but
definitely.
So, yeah.
Now, looking at some of your material, your videos, and reading one of your books, I've discovered that you are anti-chair.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, right before I signed on here, I begrudgingly, I don't know if you can see, I have a stand-up desk behind me. I begrudgingly said, with the lighting in this room, I'm going to have to sit down for this interview. And no, you got to spend less time in chairs. You really got to try it. It took me a while to get fully adjusted. I brought a stand-up desk home, and then I brought one to work. And, you have to build up your stamina. But once you do it, my back is better and stronger. My posture, my knees, a lot of things that used to ache really don't anymore. So I think chairs are very comfortable, but like most things that feel good in the moment, they're not so great for us in the long term. And our bodies were just not made to be in that posture. They just weren't. We evolved for millions of years, mostly standing, sometimes squatting, sometimes laying, sometimes leaning, but never sitting. Having the weight distributed in that way is not particularly good for us. So get out of your chair. That's what I have to say. And in fact, some studies have come out that even regular exercisers, even people who exercise every single day, can experience some of the negative effects of sitting if they sit all day. So it's even more important than exercise is to get out of your chair.
That's very interesting. You would think, just coming from a naive viewpoint, that sitting down would actually be better because you're putting less stress on your knees and your hips, I imagine. But that's not the case. No,
it's not. And you got to remember that stress, as long as it doesn't damage anything, is actually good for your tissues. And in fact, astronauts, when they come back, no matter how much they exercise when they're up there, their body is a wreck after being in 0G, because their bones not just shrink, they lose density. So they become softer, weaker. Their joints become much stiffer, but also the tendons. So ligaments are what hold your bones together, are fairly static. They don't really change too much, but tendons really do respond to stress and exercise, and they get stronger. And when your tendons are stronger, your joints are better. They're more flexible, they're stronger, they hold together. Your bones are stronger. So people with brittle bones, unless they have a vitamin deficiency, which isn't very common, it's sedentary lifestyle makes your bones weaker. It's really good to get, and it's also good to get your heart rate up.
Right.
Really. But yeah, you just, stress on the joints and the bones is a good thing to strengthen them.
Interesting. I don't want to make this interview all about me, but it turns out, from what I understand, evolution wants to make me fat.
Well, yes and no. The way to think of it is we were well evolved for the way that our ancestors lived. We're not particularly well evolved for the way that we live now. And there are some disputes in this, and I know that this is what I'm about to say is a little bit of an oversimplification. But in general, we're evolved to eat not particularly often, first of all, and to eat to acquire most of our calories from proteins and fats, and a little bit from carbohydrates and sugars. And now all of the world's staples, the staples of all the world cuisines are carbohydrate based, because carbohydrates were the easiest, the plants that give us carbohydrates were the easiest to cultivate all around the world, whether it's rice or wheat or oats or barley or any of the grains in cereals. These are just high in carbs, and they're great for giving a large amount of calories. But they're really not how our physiology is evolved, because we're not used to the heavy dose of sugar that enters your bloodstream after a high carb meal. What happens is your blood sugar spikes way higher than it would with this equal amount of calories from other kinds of foods. And when that happens, you get an exaggerated insulin response. So then it goes down again and it overshoots. So your blood sugar actually goes down an hour after you eat, more than it was in the basal. That's why you get tired in the afternoon. Like a lot of people, like at 2 or 3 in the afternoon after your lunch, you're falling asleep at your desk. We used to have seminars in graduate school, my department at 3 in the afternoon, and half the audience is asleep during the seminar.
Right.
But if you ate nuts and maybe some fruit, some low sugar fruit and nuts, that won't happen. And so I pretty much gave up carbs through dinner. At dinner time, I eat whatever I want. But throughout the day, I try to eat basically no carbs, and I don't get that lull anymore. I feel fine all throughout the day. I actually I don't eat breakfast. I think breakfast is the worst meal for anyone to eat, but it's definitely not good for me. And then I eat just a small lunch of just some fat, and then I pig out at dinner, and I eat until I go to sleep.
Really?
I still eat a lot, but I eat it all at night, and I don't get the blood sugar spikes. So, and it helps you keep the fat off.
Fascinating. So from what I understand, that a lot of animals spend a lot of their time getting food or searching for food. And so now that we obviously have as much food as we want, there's that kind of instinctual drive just to put stuff in our mouths in terms of eating and drinking.
Right. Yeah. So if you're left to your own devices, we will all just consume way more. And now, not all animals are completely consumed with the hunger and the desire to eat all the time, but that is our past, because our ancestors were foragers first and foremost. So when we left the pure vegetarian lifestyle and became more omnivorous, we were essentially foragers. So we dug up roots. We would get fruits, but remember that fruits were very small, kind of bitter and fibrous. You didn't get that many calories from fruits. And then we would occasionally stumble onto meat, usually in the form of bone marrow, because we couldn't compete with the big animals for prey, but we did have the smarts to break open bones. So probably bone marrow was our first introduction to meat eating. And then we would have the big windfalls of big game whenever we got to that point. But what that means is we are a feast and famine sort of physiology. We're good with a single meal a day, or even a meal every other day if it's big enough, and that's kind of how we're built, is for scraping every last calorie out of the food that we can.
That's fascinating.
We were not built for a buffet of sugary, carby foods, and so our bodies just like,
I think that's a great title for your next book. Not built for buffets.
Not built for buffets, and I love buffets, I really do, but. I just don't have it for lunch. Have it for dinner. Right.
Words of wisdom there. So tell me, under what circumstances, and we're going to get a little crass here. We're going to get a little scatological. Tell me when it's okay for me to eat, or what for a person to eat their own poo.
I know where you're going with this. So we have a very curious, weird relationship with one particular vitamin B12. And vitamin B12 is also called cobalamin. It's a funny vitamin in the sense that most animals have no trouble getting it. So herbivores have so you find it in meat is the natural sort of dietary source of this. So obviously carnivores get it from the meat. Well, carnivores for the most part eat herbivores. So where do herbivores get it? Well, herbivores get it from the intestine, from the bacteria that live in their intestine. And they have so herbivores come in sort of two categories of the ruminants and the other category, which I'll talk about in a second. And the ruminants, they mix up their large and small intestine all get all mixed up. And anyway, they absorb vitamin B12 that way. Well, humans are sort of stuck in the middle. So we require vitamin B12 in our diet because the bacteria that make it in our large intestine, but we can't absorb it there. We only are physically able to absorb vitamin B12 in our small intestine, which comes before the large intestine in the flow of traffic. So it's kind of the great irony is that you can be vitamin B12 deficient, and some vegans are if they don't think about where they're getting B12, but yet your colon is full of it, not full of it, but it's got it, and you're sending it to the toilet instead of absorbing it. And that's the irony. And I know whenever I bring this up, people start to wonder where your mind just went. And sure enough, a study was done that it is a dietarily sufficient source of vitamin B12 is human feces. I hope you won't go to that lengths. I hope you never find yourself that desperate for B12. But it's an important lesson there because it shows that omnivory, that stage that we had when we transformed ourselves from vegetarians to omnivorous. We were clearly getting the vitamin B12 from somewhere. And for whatever reason, and actually I'm working on this in my lab right now, for whatever reason, we stopped expressing the vitamin B12 receptor, the importer, in the large intestine. And I don't know why. It would be a perfect place to get it, but we only express it in the stomach pretty much, and then we reabsorb it in the small intestine. So yeah, if you're absolutely dying of vitamin B12 deficiency, then go ahead and knock yourself out. But it's much easier to get it these days. Have a little bit of meat. Actually, there is a vegan form of vitamin B12, a natural occurring one, and that's seaweed. So if you like sushi or seaweed chips, any of those, that's got vitamin B12 in it. So you don't need.
I had no idea. I had no idea that seaweed had.
Yeah, you can find it in kelp. Yeah, you can find it in kelp. So you don't have to be that desperate. But I mean, it's probably easier to find poop than kelp.
Good. So, how did our species, when we started eating meat, how did that affect us? Did that give us like a turbocharge of calories for us to do stuff with?
It did, yeah. So that was, a lot of people would say that the transition to meat eating, and particularly in meat processing, actually, was such a windfall in calories that it probably was required for the expansion of the brain that happened later. Remember that one event may depend on another, but it doesn't mean that that's why that event happened, right? It's just after then, what's that? Post hoc, proctor hoc, whatever that expression is. The point being that, so when we went from sort of being foragers to being more intentional meat eaters in the sense of hunters, we were getting access to a lot of calories, a lot of excess calories. We could eat all that we could. And so under those conditions, the energy demands of a growing brain were not such a burden. And that's what to connect back to what I was saying before, that's why so many other animals haven't developed these big brain, is that it really isn't that big of an advantage until it's really far along. And to get there, you have to have an excess of calories, and most creatures don't. So we did, when we started eating meat, it really allowed us the expansion of the brain. That's the current thinking. Now, I should say a lot of the stuff in anthropology is, it's an evolving discipline, and our knowledge is always kind of growing and changing. So I shouldn't say it too definitively, but it does appear that, especially in the processing of meat, cooking first and foremost, but other forms of processing meat really made a big difference. Guys, I don't know if you've ever tried to eat raw meat. You have to chew for like hours to get it down. It's really, really hard, especially red meat. You really, white meat as well. It really can't. You have to cook it to get. It's like starting digestion, before you get to it. So it's offloading. It's outsourcing the work of digestion. And that's right, because we have fairly short guts. Many animals have much longer guts than we have. We have fairly short guts, and when we started eating meat, we had a massive influx of calories. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people say, what's the most natural human diet? Is it a vegetarian diet? So I always say the most natural human diet is variety. Now, that can be a variety that includes meat to be healthy. You can definitely eat meat and live a healthy lifestyle, or it can be variety without meat. I myself am what I call I don't call this, I'm borrowing the term, a reducitarian, in the sense that eating meat has become morally difficult to defend for a variety of reasons. And I'm not even talking about animal welfare, but that alone should be a reason. But environmental and also what it does to our food and everything else. I try to eat as little meat as I can, and you can be very healthy on a meat-free diet. I have kids, and I also don't do the cooking in the house either, for the most part. So I can't really. I only have so much influence over what we eat. So we go meatless as much as we can, and you can be very healthy that way. And we have long enough guts to live that way.